Welcome to each ePathshala PG courses on computer science. Now let us see about the 10th module, which is more about the XML schema. The objectives of this module is to learn more about XML schema, to understand more about the simple and complex type definitions, and to know more about the type extensions. So basically in XML, we will know that the XML data components are of two types. They are elements and attributes. Here you can see that this is called as an element, the article is an element, and the attribute is mDate, and editor is another element, and we know that all the elements have an open and closed tags. So elements in XML document follows a hierarchical structure with open tag and closed tag pairs, and they may also include nested elements, and elements may include attributes within the elements open tag, and multiple elements may also have the same name, and the order matters in an XML document. Whereas attributes are named values, they are not hierarchical. So attribute name followed, they are like key value pair. So you have an attribute name and every attribute will be given in single value. So only one attribute with the given name per element will be available, and here the order does not matter. So now we will see that what are simple and complex elements. So as we have seen earlier, a simple element is one that contains text and nothing else. And so simple elements cannot have attributes, they cannot contain other elements, they cannot be empty, it cannot be of different types. But the text can be of different types, and you can have restrictions applied on simple types. If an element is not simple, then it is called as complex. So any complex element may have attributes, and a complex element may be empty, or it may contain text, other elements, or both text and other elements. So how to define a simple element? So a simple element is defined as this. So we know that this is the namespace prefix, and you qualify this element schema component element as XS, and then you give the name of the element and the type of the element. And this element tag may have other attributes. So here you can see that the other attributes a simple element may have are default and fixed. So the simple element may have a default value. So if no value is specified, this default value will be taken, and this simple element may have a fixed value. So if no other value can be specified, then it's going to take the same fixed value. Now we can see that name is the second component in this element tag is the name. It defines the name of the element, and the most common values of type are going to be like string, or it can be an integer, or it can be a date, time, it can be a decimal, it can be boolean, and there are lot other basic types. How do we define an attribute? So attribute themselves are always declared as simple types. So when you want to define an attribute, you specify the tag as an attribute tag. It's qualified with XS. Elements are qualified, elements are given as the basic elements are defined as element tag. The attributes are defined as the attribute tag. We will give the name of the attribute and we will specify the type of the attribute. So as applied to elements, we will use the basic types can be given in the type attribute. The other attributes a simple attribute may have are default, fixed, use, it can be optional or required. So if the attributes can have a default value, if no other value is specified, then you will use the attribute as default with the default value given. If you say that the attribute will always take this fixed value, then you will use the attribute call fixed and you will give a fixed value. And the next component is going to be a next attribute that can come in the attribute tag is use. So, you will say that it can be optional or required. So, if the attribute use is given as optional, then the attribute is not required. If it is required, then the attribute must be present for every XML document. Next, we will see that how to define the restrictions. So, restrictions can be applied to simple type as well as to complex type. So, whenever you want to have a control over the ordering or you want to have a control over the structure, how it has to appear in the XML document, then you put an restriction. So, the general form for putting a restriction is going to be looking like this. So, you will say that this is how you put a restriction on simple types. So, you define an element with the name of the element, or it can be a defining an attribute in an XML document. We will put a restriction. So, use the keyword called restriction, and you will say that what is the base type. It can be basic primitive types that are defined in the XML schema types, and we follow, and here are the restrictions. So, now with an example you can see that the element, the name of the element is age, and you put a restriction. You say that the base type is going to be integer, and you say that the minimum inclusive is going to be 0, which means that it includes a 0, and you give a range, you try to give a range for the age, the element age. So, you will say that the age can be 0 and it can go up to 140. So, you can say that you can put a minimum inclusive or maximum and up to maximum inclusive. Inclusive means that it includes this value. So, 0 and 140. So, we can have restriction on numbers like min exclusive, min inclusive. We will also have min exclusive, and you have a max exclusive and max inclusive and max exclusive. So, min inclusive means that it is greater than or equal to the given value. Min exclusive maybe it is like greater than the given value. Max inclusive is less than or equal to, and max exclusive is in less than. And you can put a restriction on the total number of digits. Use the keyword called total digits. So, you will say that exactly these many digits has to be present. You can put a restriction on the fractional digits. So, you can say that the number must have no more than this value digits after the decimal point. And we can also place restriction on strings. So, you can say that the string, you use the attribute called length. So, you will say that the string must contain exactly these many value characters. You can say that min length, you can use the keyword called min length. This will say that the string should contain at least these value characters. Maximum length, it can contain no more than these many characters. You can give a pattern. Pattern can be given as a regular expression, and the string, that a string should match with it. And you can also place restriction with the white spaces, and you can say that when you use white spaces, it tells what to do with the white spaces. So, when you use a white space, it comes with attributes like value equal to preserve, or you will say that value equal to replace, or you will say that value equal to collapse. So, preserve means that you want to keep all white spaces. Replace means you want to replace all white space characters as characters to spaces, and if you say collapse, you want to remove all the leading and trailing white spaces, and you want to replace all the white space with a single space. Now, we will see that how you can do an enumeration. So, an enumeration will restrict the value to be one of the fixed set of values. So, like in C or C++ or in C or C++, we can define a type to be an enumerated type. So, here you can say that the element name is season. You define it as a simple type. So, any element that contains only text is called as a simple type, and but you can have restrictions on the applied on the simple type as well as on the complex type. So, this element has a restriction. So, you can say that the base type of this element season is going to be a string type, and it can take values with the any of this fixed set of values. So, you will use the keyword called enumeration. Value can be spring, summer, autumn, fall or winter. So, this is how you define enumerations with the restriction data type. Now, we will see that what is the syntax to define complex elements. So, we know that what is a complex element. So, any complex element has to be defined with a data type called complex type. So, it is no more simple type, instead you call it as complex type. So, the basic syntax is the element and the name of the element is given. Following it, you will say that the complex type and the information about the complex type. So, here is an example. There is an element which is name of the element is person, and it is defined now as complex type. So, when you say that it is complex type, then the complex element may contain some sub-elements. So, you can see that person has got element like first name and last name. So, we sequence these sub-elements. So, sequence says that the elements must come in this order. So, here you can see that the person has got an element, sub-element called first name, and it has got another element called last name. So, these are simple elements defined with name and type. So, first name by itself is in simple type, last name by itself is in simple type, whereas the element person is a complex type as defined as in complex type, and you sequence this first element and first name and last name to mean that this element should come in order within this person element. Now, let us see about what is global and local definitions. So, elements declared at the top level of a schema are available for use throughout the schema, whereas elements that are declared within a complex type are local to that type. Say for example, we saw this example element, the name of the element is person. It is defined as the complex type, and this complex type has got two other sub elements called first name and last name, and we define the first name as a string type and the last name as string type. So, this first name and last name are local to the type called person. So, they are locally declared. So, anything that are declared at the top level of a schema are globally available, and you do not specify the order in the XML data document. So far we have seen about how to declare the types, and we have not seen how to use them. So, to use a type you will use the keyword called type. So, you give a name for your type and later you refer to this type. If you want to use the type, then you will use the name that is specified in the type attribute. So, we will see an example. Here the element student is defined, and here you can see that the type is given as person. So, earlier we have seen that element name equal to student, type equal to some predefined type. Now, this example we can see that type equal to person, which means that person is a type that you want to use it. So, person is already a defined type by you and you want to use it, and professor is another element whose type is also person. So, whenever the scope is very important, why? Because if it is globally available, you can use it anywhere. If it is locally available, you cannot use it outside a declaration. Now, we can see about model groups. Model groups are used to define an element that has a mixed content or an element content. So, you can use group, which means that model groups means that it is like composing the elements, composition. So, we have studied about the concept called composition. How do we compose all the elements within an element? So, you can say you will use keywords like all, you can use keyword like choice, or you can use a keyword like sequence. So far we have seen examples where you have used the group element called sequence. So, I told you that if you use a sequence, all the elements specified must must appear in the specified order. You sequence it. Say for example, you have used a element, you have defined an element called name. The name has got two other sub elements called first name and last name. Then you define the name as a complex type, and the first name and last name are going to be simple types, and you want to sequence it. So when you use the keyword sequence, you specify that the first name should appear first and then the last name. So it should come in order. Choice means that any of the elements specified may or may not be there. You can, anything that is present in the group can appear. If you say that order or all, then you will know that the elements must all be there, but it can be in any order. So you do not put restrictions in the how the element should appear in the document, XML document. So if you say that, if you use the keyword like all the elements in the group should appear, but it can be in any order. Now we can see an example for how to use the sequence. So here you can see that the element name is person. It is defined as a complex type. After that you use the keyword called sequence, and here you can see that this person has got first name and last name. Use the keyword as sequence. So they must occur in the specific order. How do we use the all, the keyword all? So this allow elements to appear in any order, but all the elements should be available in the person element. So the same case here, the person element is defined as a complex type. Instead of sequence, you have used an all. So here it means that the members of the group can occur once or not at all. Despite the name, the members of an all group can occur once or not at all. So here you can use, you can put a restriction, say that you can use a keyword like min occurs equal to 0 to specify that the element is optional, but default value is 1, all the elements should appear. And in this context, the maximum occurs is always once, is always 1. Now similarly, you can also use referencing in the XML element. So once you have defined an element or an attribute, you can refer it with a keyword called ref. So here you can see an example. You define an element called person, and you say that the person has got first name and last name. You can now use this defined person in the other element called student. So here you say that element name equal to student, you say that it refers to the element called person, or just you can use access element refer equal to person. And now if text element has attributes, so it is no longer, if a text element has attributes, it is no longer called as a simple type, you call it as a complex type. So you have to use it, you have to define it as a complex type. So here the element is population, and you define it as a complex type because this element population has got an attribute. Now whenever you have an attribute, make use of simple content, and now you say that extension, the base is equal to it's of integer type, and now the population is of integer type, and now it has got an attribute. So it has got an attribute with name called year and the type as integer, then you properly close it. Then we can also have empty elements. So empty elements, we can see that they are very complexly defined in an XML schema. So here the name is counter, it is an empty element. So it is defined as a complex content, and extension is base, it can be of any type, and it has got an attribute. This counter element is an empty element which has got an attribute called count, and the type of this count is an integer, and it closes. Okay. So nothing, no content defined for this, it is an empty element, it just has one attribute. Since it has got an attribute, we define the type as a complex content. Now how do we define a mixed element? So mixed element has got text with other elements. So whenever you have a mixed element, use a keyword or attribute called mixed equal to true and to the complex type element. So this attribute mixed equal to true comes with the complex type element. So, here you can see that the name of the element is a paragraph. The paragraph is a mixed type. So, you will say that it is of complex type, and you now use mixed equal to true, because this paragraph contains elements and text, and you want to sequence it. You say that paragraph contains another element called some name, and the type is going to be of any type, and then you sequence it. So, what is important here is that if you create a mixed element, if you want to define a mixed element, then in the complex type element tag, you want to use the keyword, you have to use the keyword called mixed equal to true. Now, we can also use extensions. So, you can base a complex type on another complex type, which means that if you have already created a complex type, you can now use this complex type to create another complex type. So, now you can see the basic syntax is like this: complex type name equal to some type, and you say that it is a complex content. Use the keyword as extension because you want to extend its type. You say that base is other type, and then you put your stuff here. This is an example of creating the complex type. So, here you can see that the element name is employee, the type is given as person info type. So, now you define this to be a complex type. So, the complex type has got a name called person type, person name type. Now, this name employee, the element employee has got two other sub elements called first name and last name. These are defined as basic types. Now, what you want to do is you want to create another type based on this person name type. So, you create another complex type. Now, here name equal to person info type. Here you say that complex content, you want to extend it. So, you will say that the base type is what? Person name type. This is what you want to extend it. So, base is person name type. So, along with this first name and last name, you want to add three other elements called address, city and country. So, now person info type is another type which is extended along with the first name and last name. You have address, city and country. So, how to use the type extensions? So, if you have already created a complex type, you can just simply use it. So, here you can see that an element called employee, you try to include the namespace instance, and here you can see that there is an attribute called no namespace schema allocation. You just put the type extension dot xsd. This is an already defined types are available in this schema definition. You just include it here. Now, how do you define a simple content in complex type? So, when do you do it? So, if a type contains only simple content, because where you can say that a text with attributes, then a simple content element can be put inside this complex type. So, here you can see that the element is dialog, it is a complex type, you put a simple content, and then you will say that extension basis, its a basic type is string, and it has got only the attribute. So, here the name of the attribute is speaker, you say that it is required attribute. So, you put within a simple content and extension, you define an element with an attribute. Now, we can see that there are predefined string types. So, there are predefined like access string, this is a, to define a string type we normally use string, and if you say that a string should not contain any tabs, new lines or carriage returns, then you can use a type called normalized string, and if a string should not contain any white space or other than the single spaces, then you can use a type called token. These are basically string type, and the allowable restriction on these types are enumeration, length, maximum length, min length, pattern and white space. We have seen some examples related to it. And the predefined date and time formats are date, time. You can see that what is the format of defining a date. This is the format of defining a time, and date time is the format here. Here T is a part of the syntax. Allowable restrictions are listed here. And the predefined numeric types are decimal, byte, short, int, long, positive integer, negative integer. So, these are all predefined numeric types. The allowable restrictions that you can use with these numeric types are listed here. Now we can see that this is an example of types, how to reuse the types. So here you can see that the element, you create an address, you say that it is a complex type, it has got street, apartment and zip code. Now you create another element called address type, and you can say that it has street, apartment, zip type, but here you have defined this address as an element, whereas here you have defined this as an type. So you say that the complex in the element tag you give the name, whereas here in the complex type tag you have given the name as address type. So now when you create another element called ship address, you have given the type as address type, which you have already created. So this way, when you create a complex type, you give a name for the type and you can reuse it in another types to define other data types. So complex type definition can also go with composition. You know that model group is composed of compositor like sequence, choice, all. We have seen several examples. And the particles can be simple element declaration, wildcard or model group. We can also have annotations. Annotations normally provide for human and machine targeted documentation. They are actually it provides the metadata. So when you want to create annotation, use the keyword called annotation. So it's a simple type, use the keyword annotation and you say that what's the document, the application information, all these. So these are the meta information you want to provide for the XML document. So this is a simple example of declaration. So here you can see that the element purchase order, you give the type as purchase order type and you give another element as gift. It is a complex type. Within the gift you have birthday and then the element which refers to another type called purchase order, and then here is where you have defined an attribute. You give the keyword as required, and here is where you have defined a notation and you have said that what is the thing, viewer.exe. So this is an XML schema, a simple XML schema. It starts with XML version, then schema definition, the elements declaration, attributes and so on. Now we have understood that there exist a variety of data facets and patterns to impose domain constraints. We have seen how we have defined we can define an XML schema. We have also seen how to apply inheritance, and there are also advanced constraints like primary key and referential integrity that can be imported in an XML schema. Thank you.